And now anyone should say that DroidCon doesn't work. I met these people the first time at DroidCon Torino some years ago, and very recently they sent me one of their very latest x86 boards. And I'm an electrical engineer, and in this video I will look at it from our point of view to see what is good and what is bad about it. And yes, this thing can run Windows. Here we have the actual UPS delivery box, which is kind of well packed. So let's see what we get. And yes, anybody who knows UPS Hungary knows that you cannot pack the stuff well enough because they just misplace everything. This parcel here, for example, they managed to send to an office where they didn't have a delivery authorization for like months. But well, who cares? Here we go, and tada! We get the Udoo box, Udoo Vision, and then we also get this little separate box here with the power supply. And now let's start to unbox the main process computer. We see here it's just sliding open in this usual Apple-esque fashion. Then here we have the getting started instructions, and below that we already find the process computer in its little brick here. I'm gonna be careful because I don't want to damage the super new unit, so it's a bit of a tight fit. But yes, this is very nice, by the way that they package it. And now that I'm going in here, what do we see? We see, that's the machine. And yes, this is most definitely one of the larger process computers I've seen. And there is something loose here. That's the battery. We're gonna look at it in a minute. And yes, here is the second box, and that is the dedicated power supply for the unit. As we can see here, it's a typical wall wart, which you then just plug into the machine to provide the power. And yes, the getting started board, of course, the card here, it says how to get started, check it out online. And what I find very interesting is that Udoo also get into the aftermarket parts business. You see here, they advertise a metal case, and you also see here that they even advertise an AI camera. But these are two peripherals which I won't be using for this review right here. And yes, now we can look a bit in more detail at the board. Here we have the Arduino Leonardo connector on the back for external hardware. Here we have a full M2 complement for M2 cards. This is a classic SATA 3.0. Over there we can put in a micro SD card. That's the power supply. That's the mini display port. And one more very cool thing, we've got two Ethernet ports and two USB 3.1 type boards. And yes, this at the bottom is a huge heatsink because this uses a very powerful Intel Atom chip, and this is needed to dissipate the heat. And yes, here we've got these things where you can fit inside screws that you can have some. And yes, this board is kind of heavy. So let's put it here. We see, we see here a nice weight of 254.99 grams. As you see here clearly, it's quite a heavy board and much heavier than, for example, a Raspberry Pi or something similar. Installing the operating system on the Udoo is a bit different than to what you know from classic process computers, because this thing in essence is an x86 PC and it only has two USB ports. So here we have a USB stick containing a stinknormal Windows 10 image, and here I have a hub with the mouse and the keyboard. And yes, this is also important. This thing has a mini DP port like Lenovo laptops, so you need one of these adapters if you want to go HDMI. So, and now I've plugged this in. Only if I push it down, it starts. That's very strange. Looks like there has been some kind of transport damage. And well, because I really want to get it running, you see I've put a weight on the back of the plug, and now we hear the fan is spinning. And yes, I did want to share something because I found something out. The connector is highly sensitive to the orientation. When you put the machine like this, you don't have any problems with rebooting. I mean, I personally find this a bit bad because it greatly limits the potential of the process computer in applications where it is not always straight and level, but nevertheless, this is the way to make it work properly. And yes, as we see here, after some time the machine basically starts into a completely normal Windows setup, like any other x86 workstation. And yes, the reason why we didn't see anything before was that these HDMI converters are known to be highly sensitive to the cable quality used. And I had to use a very, very high quality HDMI cable to get the studio screen to work. And yes, the rest of the Windows 10 setup is just completely bog standard. It's literally like a Windows 10 PC. The one thing which might be interesting is the question of the hard disk. And you see here I have a 60 GB partition, so I just click New, Apply, OK. And basically I didn't insert a memory card or anything. It's the memory which is already on the machine. And so I then just go next, and now it just runs its normal setup. And yes, just in case any one of you has been wondering or screaming in the background, Tam, why didn't you use Windows 11? The answer to that is here. As you can see, I'm remoting into my machine and I can download this little requirements checker here. And yes, here I'm going to click the Check Now button, and here we already see the problem. It is the CPU which is not supported for Windows 11. So this is a Windows 10 only machine. To understand the actual GPIO architecture, it's best to use this document, which sadly is quite well hidden. And this diagram is actually the most important thing. Here in the middle we see the main Intel chip. And then here we see the Atmel Arduino subsystem. But the interesting thing is that there is also an additional module, namely here the MEC 1705. And this, if you look at its datasheet, is basically a GPIO driver chip. And what they do with it is, first of all, they have two serial ports, and secondarily, a few GPIO pins. And this continues if we look here. Here we see a GPIO header in addition to the Arduino header. And this GPIO header here is provided by the MEC 1705. And yes, on the back we also have a dual USB and a dual COM port. And as you see here, if you look in more detail, you get further information about how these parts actually are pinned out. So for example, here we have the two independent USB 2 ports which you can attach to a PCB or something like that. And yes, there is also an M2 slot at the back in case you want to attach some larger, more bandwidth hungry things. But be that as it may, now it's time to look in more detail at what the Arduino thing actually does for us. And now we come to trying to play around with the Arduino Leonardo. Here we see there is a USB serial device on the planar. And very probably because there is no other serial port, this is going to be where the Arduino sits. And here we have the Arduino IDE version 2. And you see here I can select the Arduino Leonardo. And in theory I can run a program on it just as if it were a native Arduino. So this should prove that in principle this part of the system works. So, and now to come a little bit to the criticism. This mostly, I believe, is just oversights. The first problem is here, of course, this connector. As we saw before, if the board is like this, it doesn't power on. That is just, I don't know why. Especially because here and here, they use more robust connectors. So why in the name they didn't put another one here? And yes, a corollary to that, you see if you put it like so, it doesn't stand stable. The reason for this is that these pins are a little bit too short and so it stands on these ports. That's also not a particularly good idea from my point of view. And then the final, third and biggest criticism for me is the way they designed the real-time element. I mean, I fully understand the idea that they wanted to go as close as possible to the classic Arduino. And by the way, I don't think this is a cost-saving measure. This is an Italian company. They don't do cheap very well. Italians don't do cheap. So I think this was a genuine strategic mistake. They wanted to go as close as possible to the Arduino, and then they looked at the whole Arduino situation, Arduino civil war, Arduino this, Arduino that, and decided to go for the safest possible solution, which was the Leonardo with this connector here. But I see two problems. First of all, this connector is very uncommon. Its pitch is smaller than the normal what you find on Raspberry Pi and Co. And it doesn't mate too well with a classic DuPont pin. And so it's already exotic. So what I don't understand is why didn't they just take a more exotic approach and here, for example, use a Giga device or something like that, a more powerful chip and another connector. And of course, as a corollary, if they have one uncommon connector, why didn't they also use a more uncommon power supply? But in general, I like this board a lot. And yes, once again, to mention this here in the back, this is a power battery. It's a battery which ensures that the real-time part of the system keeps working even if there's no power, so the clock doesn't get lost. And now we've come to the end of this little video. And it's a very difficult decision. I mean, on the one hand, I love the board, especially also because it provides a rich Windows environment, which lets you use all kinds of very advanced software, which you can't run so easily on Windows on ARM or even on a process computer Linux. But on the other hand, of course, some of the weaknesses are just very, how should I say, disappointing. It's a pity that Udoo hasn't worked more with an electrical engineering company on the design of the board in terms of adapting it to the needs of, let's say, process computers, drones, something like this. But nevertheless, I like this board a lot. Congratulations to Udoo for the job, and I hope that the next revision will be better.